Hello, Andrew. Welcome to our little show.
Hello.
Uh, this is It's Your Time You're Wasting, and we've been wasting a bit of your time already today, and I do apologize for that. I
It's
hope
fine.
you're ready for, for a few questions because you wrote an article in the Sunday Mail on Sunday.
Man on
That's
Sunday, yeah.
that caused a bit of disturbance, or shall we say, in teacher Twitterland. And
Yeah,
I
I
think
didn't really see that.
half of that, well, I think half of that is because you actually wrote it in the Mail on Sunday, which also might cause a
Yeah.
few ruptures in itself. But I'm going to give the title here. Now that BLM, Black Lives Matter, has gone mainstream, our children are being brainwashed by a divisive new dogma that I fear will stoke, not heal, racial tensions. So we're going to discuss that. But
Yeah.
in the first place, Andrew, you were a teacher.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what you taught,
Um,
etc.?
I was a teacher for, well, a number of years. Originally I taught at a school called the Royal Hospital School in Ipswich in Suffolk, which is a boarding school. At the time I was there, it was full boarding, and I was a resident tutor as well as a teacher. So it was very full on insofar as we were teaching 6 days a week, and then on the seventh day I had house duties anyway. I had duties in the evenings, so it was pretty much constant, And then I moved to a school called Merchant Taylors in Watford, and then went part time when I started to earn enough money to do comedy. I went part time and uh, worked at the City of London School for Girls for just on a part-time contract for a couple of years, with a brief moment where I skipped away to a school called Francis Holland in Sloane Square, but I resigned after 2 weeks because of objectionable behaviour by the headmistress. So that's pretty much my journey there.
Now that you know that should be a follow-up question about that behavior, but I'm not going to go there because we want to try and focus on the
Yeah,
article. Now, even though your article is um, titled about Black Lives Matter, it's not just about race there. So I'm going to start with a thing about gender, really. Now, you quoted here, increasingly parents are seeing for themselves the result of this sudden politicization of the classroom,
hmm,
and children taught that gender is a total fiction.
yeah,
Talk about the 100 genders. Oh yeah, you don't talk about it. A relation of mine came back from school saying that there are 100 genders. So this
yeah.
is not just one or two schools, as far as I can work out. And when argued with, she said, "No, it's a fact. It's a fact." So you talk about a book which was given out to kids called "Who Are You?" The Kids' Guide to Gender Identity.
Well, that was
But
actually an American book, I should point out, and it's a few years old now. But from what you're saying, it sounds very much, and from teachers I've spoken to, it sounds very much as though this stuff has, as always, it migrated from America over to here. I think.
So, do you think, though, this might be some sort of a big moral panic coming up? I mean, in 1988, the government banned the promoting and the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality.
Yeah,
And Margaret Thatcher, led a sort of moral crusade against te- uh, pupils thinking they have an inalienable right to be gay and things like that.
yeah, yeah.
Are you sort of the modern day Margaret Thatcher in this case?
The opposite, because the social justice movement is the moral panic. So what I'm objecting to is the moral panic. Similarly, with Section 28, the local government said that you were allowed to teach mention homosexuality as long as it is linked to the spread of AIDS. I think that was the actual phrasing, uh, and that you could only talk about gay relationships as being a pretended family relationship. So those sort of things, which we obviously moved beyond because, as you say, it was a moral panic. Well, we have a similar moral panic now in terms of a social justice movement that is convinced that we live in a nation of fascists, racists, evil people. They believe that there is oppression absolutely everywhere, and in order to combat oppression and to prove that gender is a social construct, they should construct as many new genders as possible. So there's all these very sort of alarmist, irrational. I suppose at the heart of it, it's a lack of rational thought, which was the same as the moral panic with Section 28. So what I'm doing is actually opposing the moral panic, not supporting one.
Okay. Now, some people might come back to you and say, well, for a trans child or someone who's not sure of their gender identity as a pupil in school, they need to have their story told as well somehow and find themselves somewhere in the curriculum. Do you agree with that or not?
I think when it comes to children, I'd be very, very wary about drawing any conclusions on how they identify. Children don't know how they identify. They're too young to have formulated these ideas. And I don't think encouraging them to think rigidly about gender identity is a very good idea. I mean, feminists in particular have worked for many years to try and break down this idea that gender is fixed and rigid, and that boys naturally play with blue and girls like pink, and girls don't like football and boys do, and all these sort of gender stereotypes that are now being reinscribed. So now you'll have a situation where, okay, a girl wants to play football. Well, maybe she's a boy, so maybe that's an early indicator that she has gender dysphoria and maybe should transition. Well, this is a very reactionary and conservative view of gender, and one that I thought we'd got over. There's nothing wrong with a boy behaving in a traditionally feminine way, and there's nothing wrong with a girl behaving in a traditionally masculine way. And to try and suggest to a child that this means their entire identity should be reconsidered is a problem. I also think it's a problem to focus on identity anyway. I think it's regressive. I do not consider myself Uh, a gay man. I'm a man who happens to be gay. Like it's as mundane and important as being right-handed or being blue-eyed or whatever. To me, it's just something else about you. It's not your whole life. So I mistrust this idea of telling children that everything about the world should be seen through the prism of race, gender, and sexuality. And that is what you are. You are part of a demographic. You are no more than that. You're not an individual with individual thoughts and feelings and ideas. It's basically the politics of identity. I think is bad for everyone, and I think it's particularly bad for kids.
Okay. Now, you talk about CRT, critical race theory. Can you just give me a brief idea what you mean or what they mean by critical race theory?
Yeah, critical race theory is an offshoot of what of postmodernism. It's there's many branches of postmodern theories. Many of them don't even use the word postmodern. So there's some ambiguity about what that means, and it's very highly contested. But just to give a simplified version, it's branches such as queer theory, intersectional feminism, disability studies, fat studies. So basically, identity groups, uh, and it's a form of activism as well. So it's I suppose it's activism masquerading as academia. And that's what critical race theory is, another branch of this, which incorporates elements of intersectionality, which comes from Kimberly Crenshaw and writers like that, and is now propagated most famously by people like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility. I've noticed a number of schools in the UK tweeting about white fragility, which I would say is a very bad idea because it's one of the worst books I've ever read. I mean, it is utter bunkum. And the theory behind critical race theory is this idea that you can divide society into the oppressor and the oppressed. And this is based on a system known as whiteness. And whiteness is a kind of reinscribed original sin. It's the idea of it's an essential kind of evil, I suppose. To the extent that I mean, there was an article in America about two, I think, yes, it was Indian boys, I think, had attacked a black schoolgirl, and they were described as enacting whiteness. So any kind of evil act or action is deemed to be this supremacist, oppressive force. And what this does, of course, as you'll have seen if you saw the TV show The School That Tried to End Racism, which is a Channel 4 show which you can still watch online, which is about a school that attempted to implement critical race theory. And it literally divided the class up into ethnic groups. It literally pushed onto the kids this idea that you need to see everything through your race. You should see white people as oppressors and complicit in white supremacy, even if they're toddlers, even if they're children, this incredibly divisive idea. And the reason why I wrote the article is because I think we need to get back to the system that was working, and that is the liberal system. Now, it hasn't worked in all cases, and no one at all has ever suggested that racism no longer exists and isn't a problem that needs to be resolved. But the way that you resolve it is not through another racist system, which is critical race theory. You solve it through the principles of liberal values. And that's why it's very disturbing that it's infiltrated schools in this way.
That's brings me to the next sort of question here, because if we're talking about a liberal system, if you like, then at the core of that is the idea of free speech, debate,
Yeah.
looking at more than one side of the argument. So if that is the case, is it okay to teach critical race theory in context of lots of other theories that might also perhaps
Sure.
explain the way the world is or something?
The problem with critical race theory and theories like it is they don't stand up very well to scrutiny. So once you start talking about them and debating them, they fall apart pretty rapidly. And of course, that's why the proponents of these theories are so reluctant to have debates. They don't. They say that these things are beyond debate. You know, you'll have militant trans activists saying, "I'm not going to have anyone debate my right to exist." That's not a proposition anyone has ever made, by the way. It's a rhetorical ploy in order to stop you having a sensible conversation about it. So it's the same with this. I would be fine. You can go into schools. I mean, it's not really appropriate for primary schools because they won't understand it. But you maybe sixth formers, you could talk about critical race theory, and you could have a discussion and debate about what its flaws are, what its good intentions are. I'm sure there are good intentions behind a lot of it. And within about 10, 15 minutes with intelligent kids, it will become immediately apparent how useless it is as a theory and how divisive it is, and actually how very dangerous it is when it's accepted without any kind of thought or scrutiny.
When it comes to teaching about racism, and you've touched on this a couple of times, and you're saying almost that Martin Luther King and that sort of old-fashioned idea of what racism is, the content of character rather than the color of your skin, and judging people in that way. What sort of way do you think pupils are being taught to judge each other by now? Do you think there's
Well,
a danger that this is becoming something that you imply is racist, but perhaps within a different sort of term? Perhaps it's against white people or
Well, it's racist against white people because it's based on the assumption that they are evil and wrong. It is racist against people of color because it implies that they will always be oppressed no matter what they do. Anything they achieve, they're not going to be able to do anything. They need looking after. They need to be protected and patronized. So it's racist in all sorts of in every conceivable way it is possible to be racist. So no, it's not a system that I think should be uh, brought into schools to replace a liberal system. I don't see why it's helpful.
and the Chartered College of Teaching, you raise this issue in your article. You say they gave out some anti-racist materials that were based on critical race theory.
Yeah.
You objected to this in your article, and obviously from what you're saying, the reasons why. But do you think that they were perhaps distributed with the worst of intentions or the
Yeah.
best of
I
intentions?
think a lot of the time this is all well intentioned by people who haven't read the theories and don't understand the theories because it's couched in language that sounds so appealing. So the phrase that they will often use is anti-racism, and you've seen the other week, RADA, the dramatic school in London, students have just petitioned for them to introduce an active anti-racist policy across the board. If you read the 100-page document of demands from the students, it is genuinely unhinged. It's an absolute tract of lunacy. But uh, if you just say the phrase anti-racist, well, we're all opposed to racism, so it sounds wonderful. It sounds like a really good thing. Actually, what anti-racism does is it assumes that in any given situation, and this goes for critical race theory as well, in any given situation, racism exists. In any human interaction, racism exists. So the question isn't, is this a racist interaction or word or dialogue or whatever? The question is, how did racism manifest itself in this situation? That is actually at the core of critical race theory. In other words, everything is racist, absolutely everything. Uh, that's very dangerous because most of the time things aren't racist, and teachers are actually pretty damn good at identifying when racist things happen and challenging them. We have policies in place. We have legal obligations to do so. Telling kids that absolutely everyone is racist and everything is racist, and in order to combat systemic racism, which is a proposition, not a conclusion, but is taught as though it's a conclusion, you need to just assume the worst of everyone and suspect people and assume that people are oppressing you and the opposite of the sort of positive messages that we should be sending to kids. So that's why I don't think it has any utility.
To move on to curriculum, is there some argument for the curriculum that is, white, male, pale, stale, or whatever, that there should be a broader curriculum, more perspectives in that curriculum, that there should be work from people of different nations, different races, different, more women, but more men, more black people, more white people,
Didn't you? Like,
colonized as well as the colonialist, rather than the
well, who are the colonialists and who are the colonized? I mean, it's interesting. I'm not a colonialist. I've never colonized anyone. If you want to do this sort of sins of the fathers thing, well, that doesn't really work for me because my ancestors were colonized, because they were Irish. So, who are you talking about? It's again this collectivized thought and not thinking in terms of individuals. Um, so so no, I don't. I mean, decolonize it. Look, there have been many years people have had debates about what should be in the canon, what shouldn't be in the canon, how do these things get formed. Um, and you mentioned it yourself, the word perspectives. I think obviously seeing a range of perspectives is a really interesting idea. Perspectives are not tied to race, gender, and sexuality specifically, because one gay black man could have a completely different worldview from another gay black man. So this doesn't make any sense to think, well, if we have more black voices on the curriculum, it's going to diversify the. Well, it might not. You might just get everyone saying the same thing. Just people have different color skin. The focus shouldn't be on skin color or sexuality or anything else. The focus should be on the quality of the literature and the importance of the work in terms of the historical canon. The canon isn't just formed arbitrarily by oppressors. As Sheffield University said recently, the only reason why we're teaching Shakespeare and Chaucer is because they're white males. I mean, these are utterly absurd and historically illiterate. It's just Philistinism. That's not the reason why. The reason why is the impact that it has, a kind of cascading impact on literature and the arts that you can see. There's a reason why artists have mimicked and borrowed from the great artists of the past, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, whatever. They've taken these, they've been influenced. And the reason is that they have some kind of grounding, a natural grounding within the canon, which comes from being geniuses that inspire. So it isn't the case that a group of oppressive straight white men got together and said, right, we're only going to teach other straight white men to perpetuate this oppression. That's just as I say, a completely ignorant point of view. It's not how things work.
Is something only canonical due to time, or can something jump into the canon, straight off the stage, literally? So
I mean, rarely. I don't. If I'm going to read a novel and I want it to be good, I'll make sure it's at least 60 years old. But that's because I don't trust modern novels. I think the standards of literature have declined generally, and art generally. But there are some brilliant modern novelists. I love Kazuo Ishiguro. I love Salman Rushdie. But those are probably the only two that I would go out of my way to buy their new books. But having and certainly I think studying modern literature is a good thing, and yeah, fantastic. But I wouldn't be so arrogant as to assume that my taste now will become canonical. How could I possibly do that? I don't know how many generations of artists or writers Rushdie and Ishiguro have or will influence. They have certainly in the present day influenced an awful number of people, and I absolutely adore their work. But maybe in 5 or 6 generations' time, their work won't be considered consequential at all. I don't know. I don't have foresight. That's the point. The canon isn't just about taste, really. It's about something much more than that. Well, it is about taste, but it's about taste collectively from artists and creators and influences and that kind of thing. And these things don't happen by accident.
But was there some argument of saying that the taste has been distorted over time by the gatekeepers who actually have made sure that the canon reflects a very narrow view of society, perhaps?
I just don't see that as being an authentic point of view. And I think it's kind of a misunderstanding and a politicization of art. I don't think that artists are in the business of sending the correct moral message. I'm very much of the same view as Oscar Wilde here. Where he writes in the preface to Dorian Gray about how there is no such thing as a moral book or an immoral book. Books are badly written or well written. That is all. I'm paraphrasing there, but that's basically what he said. Yeah. So I think that's my view of art. Art is about a recreation of one's own view of the world, as Emile Zola put it, life seen through a temperament. It is a recreation. It is artifice. When the worst kind of art, I'm not saying art can't be political, but for me, the worst kind of art is when it is overly didactic. And I think it's a very reductive view of art and the history of art and literature to suggest that it is just about power play. It is just this was the problem with the whole post-structuralist, postmodern movement. Once you get into these kind of French theorists of the 1960s, it means that you end up reducing works of art and poetry to, well, it's about the deconstructive system is about trying to tease out the contradictions, identify the secret prejudices, identify how the power structures work. That means that a book. This is why when Kate Millett wrote her book *Sexual Politics* in 1970, she's an American academic, I think. Is she American? I think so. Anyway,
Yeah.
she wrote this god awful book, which basically picks apart works like by, for instance, D.H. Lawrence, and we'll go through it and say where the misogyny lies in D.H. Lawrence. Well, I don't care if D.H. Lawrence was a misogynist. I don't think that I can necessarily determine that from his work anyway, which is something that these activists come critics think they can do. I don't think you can do that. But even if you could, I don't really care. I care about the quality of the work and the importance of the work and its literary significance. So I think this is a mistaken view of art and the canon generally, which needs to be redressed.
I have a feeling that the question you ask, which was famously asked last summer, I think, Stormzy or Mozart, you might be more in the Mozart camp than Stormzy, perhaps?
Obviously. I mean, it's a preposterous and ludicrous question to even pose, and it's also incredibly patronizing to black children to suppose that they cannot possibly appreciate classical music. It's just racist.
And do you think the schools that perhaps are perceived as the most traditional, perhaps somewhere like Eton, and I think you also mentioned Elton College, who you would have thought would be sort of flying the flag for the traditions, perhaps are under some sort of threat. I must say, Elton College, I contacted them. They're not sure what you meant and where you got the idea that they were talking about decolonizing their curriculum and combating systemic racism, or intending to, so that they weren't sure where that might have come from.
It came from an article which quoted their statement. That's where that came from. So they should, if the newspaper has quoted them incorrectly, they should definitely take them up with that.
Yeah, okay. I think there's some sort of disquiet about that. But saying that, schools are being contacted by ex-pupils. Some schools are being contacted by ex-pupils
Yeah.
who are asking them to defend what happened, a few years ago
Mhm.
with the curriculum, with the teaching about whether it was systemically racist or not. And I think some schools are under the cosh about this, and are quite rightly meeting ex-pupils and current pupils and trying to sort things out with that. If you were teaching today, how do you feel the current atmosphere, shall we say, in the culture wars,
Yeah.
as you put it in your
It's
article, would
difficult because I
be?
think, with all, I mean, it's not just Eton. There are many, many, particularly private schools, putting statements out about systemic racism and the like. Now, if you want to make an accusation of systemic racism, it's quite a serious one, and it requires investigation and it requires looking at the facts. You cannot just assert it and expect everyone to fall into line and expect it to be true. We've had this before with universities. Students have recently been saying that Oxford University is systemically racist. You're not going to find a less racist place than Oxford University is not remotely racist. There's no that everyone I know who's been there, including people of color, just haven't experienced it. It's just not. It's just not happening, and even the statistics bear it out. So, you know, I'll give you a good example of this. So, the Guardian wrote an article. It was last October, and they put it was a front cover article actually. It said that the headline was something like "Racism is endemic in UK universities," and then the study that they themselves cited proved that racism is vanishingly rare in UK universities. So what is going on there? Well, what they're saying is, of course, the lack of evidence of racism is proof that racism must be systemic because we're not recording it. People who are complaining aren't being taken seriously. That kind of thing. It's this sort of fantasy. So if you're going to make an accusation that a school is systemically racist, well, I want to know, what are its racist employment policies? Where is it discriminating against people of color and how? Where is your evidence for any of this? Rather than this nebulous idea that there's this thing in the air called systemic racism, which explains absolutely everything. It's a faith-based position, and we cannot be formulating policy on the basis of faith.
Andrew, thank you very much for talking with me this afternoon, and I hope to perhaps raise these issues with you again sometime in the future. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
thanks a lot.